13 American astronauts trained to reach the moon. Not one of them ever flew in space. One of their names is on the moon right now. He never got closer than a runway in Texas. And down here on Earth, that name is still missing. I cross-checked all 73 selection files from 1959 to 1969. Between them, over 20,000 flight hours. Not 1 minute in orbit. You'd assume they washed out, but 3 were already on prime cruise, and 1 was strapped inside the first Apollo spacecraft. Between 1959 and 1969, NASA picked 73 men to fly in space. Test pilots, naval aviators, scientists with doctorates, every one of them survived the same brutal filter. The Apollo program flew 11 crewed missions, 3 seats each, 33 seats total, and many of those seats went to the same men, over and over. That's the problem. It wasn't a lack of talent. It was arithmetic. Deke Slayton ran flight crew operations from November 1963. He decided who flew, and he worked from one simple rule. A mission's backup crew rotated into the prime slot 3 missions later. On paper, clean, fair. In practice, your turn was locked in years ahead of time. And if you fell out of that chain, an injury, an accident, a budget cut, you didn't drop one place in line, you fell out of the line entirely. So the question that matters isn't who reached the moon, it's what it took to be left behind. Of those 73, 13 never reached space. We're going to walk through every one of them, one by one, and at the end, there's a second group, a smaller one. Men who lost their moon mission, waited years, and flew anyway. They have their place here too. But the first of the 13 wasn't grounded by bad luck. He already had his seat assigned. His spacecraft was already built. He was sitting inside it. On March 21, 1966, Roger Chaffee got the best news of his career. He would fly on the first crewed Apollo mission. He was 31, the youngest of the crew, and the only one of the 3 who had never been to space. His record explained why they chose him. Chaffee flew 82 missions over Cuba between 1960 and 1962, sometimes 3 in a single day, in the RA-3B Sky Warrior, the reconnaissance version of a carrier-based bomber, photographing the island during the missile crisis. That work earned him the Air Medal. Now, let's pause for a second, because there's a legend that refuses to die. Some books claim Chaffee flew the U-2 that photographed the Soviet missiles. It's not true. Chaffee was a Navy pilot. The U-2 belonged to the Air Force. He flew Sky Warriors, and that was dangerous enough. When NASA selected him in October 1963, he had more than 2,300 flight hours, over 2,000 of them in jets, and then they gave him the spacecraft. It was designated AS-204. Today we know it as Apollo 1. Here's a detail almost everyone gets wrong. Chaffee was not the lunar module pilot. That position didn't exist on this mission because this spacecraft carried no lunar module. His title was pilot, the 3rd seat, behind Grissom as commander and White as senior pilot. The reason comes down to the hardware, and that reason killed him. North American built 2 versions of the command module. Block 2 was the real lunar ship. Block 1 was the earlier version, meant only for Earth orbit. Chaffee would fly a Block 1. That spacecraft had a 2-piece hatch that opened inward. Getting out meant releasing latches by hand and pulling the hatch into the cabin. Under normal conditions, about 1.5 minutes. The cabin atmosphere was pure oxygen, and during ground tests it was pressurized above the outside air, which pressed the hatch against its frame and sealed it tighter. And running through that cabin were miles of wiring, surrounded by Velcro, nylon netting, and paper. On January 27, 1967, the crew climbed in for a countdown test with the ship running on internal power. No fuel in the rocket. The test was classified as non-hazardous. Communications failed all afternoon. At one point, Grissom asked how they were supposed to reach the moon if they couldn't talk between 2 buildings. At 6:31 p.m., a voice came over the loop. Fire in the cockpit. In pure oxygen, the flames moved faster than anyone had planned for. The pressure burst the module open. Technicians fought through the smoke toward the hatch, and the heat drove them back again and again. By the time they got it open, all 3 men were dead. Grissom had flown twice. White had been the first American to walk in space. Chaffee had waited 3 years for his turn, and he died inside the ship that was supposed to carry him up, without ever leaving the ground. The accident stopped the program for 20 months and rewrote the spacecraft from scratch. A 1-piece hatch that swung outward in seconds, fireproof materials, protected wiring, a mixed atmosphere on the pad. Everything that made the moon possible was redesigned because of that afternoon. And here's the pattern that runs through this entire story. Chaffee died inside a spacecraft. That's what you'd expect from this line of work. But he was the only one of the 13 who died that way. The others didn't fall in spaceships, they fell in airplanes. The Northrop T-38 Talon was the world's first supersonic trainer. NASA bought a fleet of them to keep its astronauts sharp. Real flying, real decisions, real speed. It also moved them between Houston, St. Louis, and the Cape. It worked, but the price was steep. Ted Freeman was the first. On October 31, 1964, he was flying home to Houston from the McDonnell plant in St. Louis. Third group selection, more than 3,300 flight hours, an instructor at the Air Force's Aerospace Research Pilot School. On final approach to Ellington, a snow goose slammed into the left side of his canopy. Shattered plexiglass went into the engines. Both flamed out. Freeman ejected too low. His parachute never had time to open. He was the first fatality in the astronaut corps. He was 34. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett died together, 16 months later. On February 28, 1966, they were flying to St. Louis for simulator training. They were the prime crew of Gemini 9, C in command, with 3,900 hours and years of test work in the F-86, the F-104, the F-4H. Bassett as pilot, with more than 3,600. Behind them, in a second T-38, flew their backups, Stafford and Cernan. The weather at Lambert Field was miserable. Rain, snow, fog. An instrument approach, C came in high. He started a tight turn around the field, trying to keep the runway in sight. Stafford pulled up into the clouds, by the book. C didn't make it. His T-38 clipped the roof of Building 101 with its right wing, skipped across the top, dropped into a construction yard, and exploded. Inside that building, in final assembly, sat their spacecraft. The Gemini 9 they were going to fly in May. They died less than 500 feet from it. The spacecraft came through untouched, and up in the clouds, Stafford and Cernan were still circling, knowing nothing. No one on the ground knew who was in the downed jet. When they finally landed, the first thing anyone asked was who they were. That's how the world learned who had died. The investigation, chaired by Alan Shepard, pointed to the weather and to pilot error, driven by the urge not to lose sight of the field. McDonnell shipped Gemini 9 to the Cape 2 days later, right on schedule. Stafford and Cernan flew the mission in June. C.C. Williams was the last, and the one who came closest. A Marine Corps major, Navy Test Pilot School, 2,500 flight hours, backup on Gemini 10, and then Pete Conrad picked him. As lunar module pilot on Conrad's crew, the backup for what would become Apollo 9. Under the 3-mission rule, that made them the prime crew of Apollo 12. Williams was going to walk on the moon. On October 5, 1967, he took off from Florida bound for Houston, with a stop planned in Mobile to see his sick father. Near Tallahassee, a mechanical failure froze his controls. He pulled the ejection handle. It didn't save him. He was the 4th astronaut from the 3rd group to die. Freeman and Bassett in T-38s, Chaffee in Apollo 1, and now him. Conrad asked for Alan Bean. Bean walked on the ocean of storms in November 1969, wearing the Apollo 12 patch on his shoulder. That patch carries 4 stars, 3 for the crew that flew, 1 for Williams. The star was Bean's idea. And on the lunar surface, Conrad and Bean left behind C.C. Williams' naval aviator wings. Now run the numbers. In the Apollo era, 4 astronauts died in T-38 accidents. 3 died inside a spacecraft, on the ground, powered down in a test classified as non-hazardous. Not 1 died on an actual spaceflight. The trainer killed more men than the spaceship, and there's still 1 more. Ed Givens didn't fall in a T-38. His story is smaller, and that's exactly what makes it the hardest to swallow. Born in Quanah, Texas, as a kid he washed cars to pay for flying lessons and hitchhiked to the airfield to take them. His parents said he never cared about anything but airplanes. He was a Mercury finalist in 1959, didn't make it. He tried again and made it in 1966, with the 5th group, more than 3,500 flight hours, 2,800 in jets. Support crew for Apollo 7, the first mission after the fire. On June 6, 1967, just after midnight, he was driving home in his Volkswagen from a meeting of the Quiet Birdmen, an aviators fraternity, with 2 other officers in the car. In Pearland, A few miles from the space center, he missed a sharp, unmarked curve and hit an embankment. His passengers survived. Givens died on the way to the hospital, 37 years old, 3 children. 4 years later, on August 2, 1971, David Scott pressed an aluminum plaque into the dust at Hadley Apennine, next to a small fallen figure. The Apollo 15 crew kept it secret until they were home. 14 names, in alphabetical order. Americans and Soviets: Bassett, Chaffee, Freeman, Gagarin, Grissom, C., White, Williams, and Givens. His name has been on the moon for over 50 years. Now go to the Kennedy Space Center. There stands the Space Mirror Memorial, designated by Congress as the National Memorial to astronauts who died in the line of duty. Polished granite, names lit from behind. Ed Givens' name is not there. The foundation that maintains the monument only includes those who died in government-sponsored missions or training. Givens died driving home, off-duty, in his own car. His fellow astronauts judged him worthy of the moon. A rule written in Florida decided he wasn't worthy of a wall. That's the man we talked about at the start. And he wasn't the only one a rule shut out. For the next men, it didn't even take an accident. A desk was enough. In June 1965, NASA did something it had never done before. It went looking for astronauts who weren't pilots. The moon wasn't just a flying problem. Someone would have to look at those rocks and know what he was seeing. The fourth group required a doctorate. Flight experience was no longer a prerequisite because NASA offered to teach them. Around 1,400 applied, 6 got in, and right there began the conflict that would define this group and the next one. NASA wanted scientists, but kept measuring them as pilots. Dwayne Graveline lasted the shortest time of anyone. A physician, a specialist in aerospace medicine. They sent him to Arizona to start jet training. He resigned on August 18, 1965, weeks after being selected. The official version, personal reasons. The real one came out years later in Slayton's memoir. Graveline had a divorce coming, and the program couldn't afford a scandal. A messy divorce meant a quick ticket back to wherever you came from. He was the first astronaut to resign before ever receiving an assignment, and one detail says a lot about him. Years later, he returned to NASA as Director of Medical Operations for the first shuttle launches. He came back to the program that had pushed him out, without ever having flown. Kurt Michel held on for 4 years, and his exit was a cold calculation. An astrophysicist, a professor at Rice, and an Air Force pilot on top of it, which put him ahead of nearly every other scientist-astronaut on the only scale the office truly valued. It didn't matter. Michel ran the numbers and they didn't work. The lunar seats were spoken for, and his turn wasn't coming. He resigned 1 week before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. His last duties as an astronaut were attending a presidential dinner, honoring that crew, and sitting in on their post-flight debriefings. He walked away listening to other men describe what the moon was like. Michel always insisted his exit accomplish something. The National Academy of Sciences was furious when he left, and that pressure helped put a geologist on the lunar surface. That geologist was Harrison Schmitt, his own groupmate. We'll come back to that seat. It cost someone dearly. 2 years after the fourth group came the sixth, and with it, the humiliation. In August 1967, NASA announced 11 new scientist-astronauts. Slayton had planned to hire up to 30, but of 923 applicants, only 11 qualified. He hired them all. By then, the post-Apollo budget was collapsing, and NASA already had more astronauts than seats. When the group reported to Houston, Slayton told them the truth to their faces. "We don't need you around here." He offered to take their resignations on the spot. Those who stayed would get groundwork, and a warning not to fool themselves into thinking they'd fly anytime soon. With gallows humor, they named themselves the XS-11. 4 of them never flew. John Llewellyn was the first to go, and his case sums up the entire conflict. A Welsh chemist, brilliant, which is why NASA hired him. But to fly, he first had to pass the Air Force jet pilot course. 4 months in, he recognized he wasn't cut out for it. His brother put it simply, he didn't have that instinct, but he had a brilliant talent for chemistry, and that's why they gave him the job. He resigned in August 1968. His life stayed remarkable. He lived in a dome on the ocean floor off the Florida coast, studying the human body at depth, and sailed across the Atlantic twice. But he never flew in space, because the system demanded he become something he never claimed to be. Brian O'Leary, an astronomer, left the same year, and wrote a book whose title said everything, The Making of an Ex-Astronaut. Philip Chapman, a physicist, held on until 1972. The cancellation of the second Skylab made it clear he wouldn't fly for at least another decade. Donald Holmquist, holder of both a doctorate and a medical degree, was gone by 1973. Of the 11, 7 stayed. And here's the twist. Those 7 became the core of the shuttle's first mission specialists. 15 flights between 1982 and 1996. One of them, Story Musgrave, flew on all 5 orbiters. The XS-11 weren't XS. They were a decade early. The 4 who left didn't fail a test. They got tired of waiting in a line nobody could promise would ever move. But at least they chose to walk away. The next man wasn't asked. John Bull had exactly the profile NASA wanted. A naval aviator. The F-3 Demon and the F-4 Phantom II with VF-114 out of Miramar. 3 Western Pacific deployments aboard the carriers Ranger, Hancock, and Kitty Hawk. Outstanding student of his class at Navy Test Pilot School. Then 2 years at Patuxent River finding out whether airplanes could land on a moving deck without killing anyone. More than 2,100 flight hours. NASA selected him in 1966, and in 1968, he got a real assignment, lunar module pilot for the LTA-8 test, with James Irwin as commander. 2 men sealed inside an actual lunar module, in a vacuum chamber in Houston, proving the ship could survive space. The kind of job you give a man who's on his way to flying. Right before the test, doctors found a serious sinus problem. He was pulled, and behind the sinus problem, they found pulmonary disease. Bull resigned in July 1968, 2 years after joining. Here's what makes his case different. Freeman was stopped by a goose, C by a cloud ceiling, Givens by a curve in the road. Bull was stopped by a medical report. The standards were merciless for one simple reason. Nobody knew what space did to the human body. When in doubt, NASA disqualified. There was no room to manage a chronic condition 250,000 miles from a hospital. So a man who could put a Phantom down on a carrier deck was out of the program because of his lungs. Bull didn't sink. A PhD at Stanford, a return to NASA in 1973, and 16 more years working for the agency that had declared him unfit. And hold on to one detail, because it comes back at the end. Being grounded by a diagnosis wasn't always forever. There was one man who refused to accept it. But first, we have to talk about the force that grounded more astronauts than every accident and every diagnosis combined. It wasn't a goose. It wasn't a pair of lungs. It was a budget line. On July 20th, 1969, the United States won the race to the moon. Less than 6 months later, it started dismantling the program that had won it. The plan ran through Apollo 20, 10 landings. On January 4th, 1970, NASA canceled Apollo 20. It wasn't exactly a lack of money. It was a choice. Skylab needed a Saturn V to reach orbit, and one was available, Apollo 20s. In September 1970 came the second cut. And here's a trap in the numbers that almost nobody explains. What got canceled then were not the missions we now call 18 and 19, as they were numbered in 1969. 2 flights were cut from the schedule, and the remaining missions were renumbered downward to close the gaps. The Apollo 15 that launched in 1971, carrying the first lunar rover, was not the Apollo 15 of the original plan. That one had been canceled, and the next mission in line inherited its number. So the canceled Apollo 18 isn't a mission that carried that number in 1969. It's the final gap left over after the whole sequence was reshuffled. Official date, September 2nd, 1970. Reason: congressional cuts to the fiscal year 1971 budget. And now the part that's hard to forgive. The hardware was already built and paid for. The workforce stayed on the payroll anyway, because Skylab needed them. The total savings from canceling 2 moon landings came to roughly $42 million. $42 million. 2 trips to the moon. There was a second factor. After Apollo 13, the feeling inside the agency was that losing a crew could end the entire crewed program. Every additional flight was a bet with NASA's whole future on the table. So who was on those flights? The honest answer, no one knows for certain, because NASA never officially assigned crews to the canceled missions. What exists is Slayton's rotation rule, so predictable the astronauts themselves could read it. Applying it, historians agree, Apollo 18, Richard Gordon in command, with Vance Brand and Harrison Schmitt. Apollo 19, Fred Haise, William Pogue, and Gerald Carr. Apollo 20, with more uncertainty, likely Conrad, Weitz, and Lausma. None of these men belonged to the 13. All of them flew in space at some point. And that's exactly what makes their case different, and in a way, crueler. Dick Gordon circled the moon on Apollo 12, while his two crewmates walked the ocean of storms below him. His turn to go down was Apollo 18. He came within 60 miles of the lunar surface and never got closer again. Fred Haise was set to command Apollo 19. Instead, he remains the man who flew to the moon without setting foot on it. After an explosion stole his landing on Apollo 13. The targets weren't minor, either. Copernicus, one of the most spectacular impact craters on the near side, and Tycho, so geologically young that landing there would have meant bending the safety rules. No one has ever gone back to either. And there's still the seed we planted earlier. When Apollo 18 was canceled, Schmidt lost his mission. He was the only geologist in the Corps, and the scientific community had been pushing for years. It worked. He was reassigned to Apollo 17, the final flight. But that seat already had an owner. Joe Engle was Apollo 17's lunar module pilot, and he held a credential no one else could match. He had flown the X-15 above 50 miles, earning his astronaut wings before NASA ever hired him. The only astronaut in the agency who arrived already wearing them. They took his seat and gave it to a geologist. Engle is the only man ever removed from a confirmed lunar landing crew. Not for a medical failure, not for an accident, but because a budget cut displaced another man, and that man needed his place. Schmidt walked on the moon in December 1972, the only geologist ever to do so. And credit where it's due, it was the right call. That mission returned the best field science of the entire program. That was no comfort to Engle. But his story doesn't end there, because Engle belongs to a different group, one we haven't told yet. The men who lost the moon, waited years, and flew anyway. Joe Engle flew again. It took 9 years. In November 1981, he commanded the space shuttle's second flight. The man pulled from the last moon landing ended up flying the ship that replaced Apollo. He wasn't the only one who learned to wait. Bruce McCandless, from the fifth group, spent the Apollo era on the ground. He was the voice of Houston during the Apollo 11 landing. He flew for the first time in 1984, 18 years after being selected. And when he finally got up there, he did something no one had ever done. He stepped away from the shuttle with no tether, powered by a maneuvering backpack, and floated free in the void. The photograph of that spacewalk is one of the most reproduced images in the history of spaceflight. 18 years on the ground, to become the first human satellite. Don Lind outlasted even that. Selected in 1966, he flew in 1985. 19 years of waiting. Anthony England, one of the XS-11, left in 1972, came back in 1979, and flew in 1985. The only one of the four who resigned who ever made it back, and made it to space. All of these men lost the moon, but none of them belongs to the 13, because all of them reached orbit in the end. 13 men never got there. These men just got there late. And one man got there 16 years late, after starting at the front of the line. In March 1962, Deke Slayton had his spacecraft, his mission, and his name picked out. He would be the second American to orbit the Earth. He was going to call his capsule Delta 7. Launch was 8 weeks away, and then the doctors put a name to an irregularity they'd known about since his selection. Idiopathic atrial fibrillation, an erratic heartbeat, with no identifiable cause. They took his mission away. Scott Carpenter flew in his place. By September 1962, Slayton was grounded for good. And when NASA grounded him, the Air Force followed. He was the only one of the Mercury 7 who never flew a Mercury mission. What happened next is what makes this story the closing chapter of every story before it. In November 1963, NASA gave him the Directorate of Flight Crew Operations, the job that decided who flew. For 8.5 years, Slayton assigned every Gemini and Apollo crew. He designed the 3-mission rotation. He decided which men would go to the moon, and he couldn't fly on any of it. It was Slayton who told the XS-11 they weren't needed. It was Slayton who gave in when Conrad asked for Bean after Williams died. It was his rule that left Gordon 60 miles above the lunar surface. The man who managed the line was the man who wasn't allowed in it. Meanwhile, he never stopped trying. Exercise. No more cigarettes, no more coffee. Doctors halfway around the world. He tried daily doses of quinidine, an experimental treatment, and it worked. But he stopped taking it against his doctor's orders, afraid that being on medication would disqualify him anyway. In July 1970, The fibrillation simply stopped. He passed a battery of cardiac exams in December 1971. On March 13, 1972, NASA announced that Deke Slayton was back on flight status. He celebrated with a full hour of aerobatics. The problem? There were no seats left. He had handed them all out himself. The chance came from the rival. In July 1975, an Apollo spacecraft docked in orbit with a Soviet Soyuz. The race that had defined his life ended with a handshake. Slayton flew as the docking module pilot, 9 days in orbit, 16 years after being selected, 51 years old, the oldest person who had ever flown in space. The man who spent a decade deciding who reached the moon never reached the moon himself. He reached something else. The only flight that existed because the race was over. All 13 were chosen by NASA, and every one of them, at the very least, appears on the official astronaut rolls. But in those same years, the Air Force selected 17 men for its own space station, a program with a public face, and a covert reconnaissance mission. They trained, they waited, and it was canceled before it ever flew. Only 7 crossed over to NASA. The other 10 appear on no astronaut list at all. That video is on your screen right now.